Good morning, everyone. I'm Courtney Johnson with the Purchasing Division. Welcome to today's session on doing business with West Virginia, presented by Technical Services Manager Mark Totten and Senior Buyer Melissa Petrie. It's scheduled to last until 11:30. The PowerPoint was emailed to you yesterday, so you can print that out to follow along or just follow along on your screen. We will be answering questions throughout today's presentation, so when you think of one, please go ahead and put it in the chat window and send to the host. Let's get started with Mark Totten.
Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be here. We are happy to bring some information to you today that is hopefully going to be helpful for your businesses in regard to business with the state of West Virginia, whether you have received orders or contracts from state agencies in the past, or if you are new to state government procurement and you want to find more information on what it would take to compete for state business. Hopefully there's something here for you. Now, the information that I want you to walk away with this morning, I'm going to outline a little bit. First of all, we're going to talk about, why does the state of West Virginia buy from vendors in the first place? What are our different purchasing methods that we use internally, and how do we relate to the private sector in terms of what we need and how we buy it? And we're going to go through a series of potential strategies that you as the private sector can use to possibly compete for state business. These different strategies will hopefully give you ideas that fit your business model and give you an avenue, the best avenue, in order to compete. All of this conversation would be useless if you didn't have a way to find out what the state needs at any given time. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about how you can find out what the state of West Virginia is trying to buy, mostly revolving around a public publication called the West Virginia Purchasing Bulletin. We're also going to talk about additional ways that you can answer the question, what does the state need right now? There are other ways that you can be alerted of bid opportunities and pursue state business, including commodity-based email notifications. In addition, there's some information on the Purchasing Division website, wvpurchasing.gov, in regard to what the state has bought in the past that may give you insight into how we're going to buy that in the future. The third strategy we're going to talk about, before which I'll need to lay some groundwork about what they are, we're going to talk about statewide contracts, which are exclusive agreements the state makes with a vendor for a particular commodity or service. This presentation is not going to be heavy on state government bureaucracy, but we will talk a little bit about what makes your business entity eligible to receive state orders in the event you are the successful vendor for an order or a contract from one of our state agencies in the 55 counties. We'll talk about the Purchasing Division's vendor registration program, and we'll also talk about the Purchasing Division's Small Women and Minority-Owned Business Certification program that may help you compete for state government orders, whether you are doing business with the state of West Virginia or not. When I turn the presentation over to Senior Buyer Melissa Petrie, she's going to get into the nitty-gritty of state procurement with you and discuss some of the state's different procurement processes and different contract types and how different solicitation methods are evaluated, so that you know how, depending on what the state is buying, the different ways in which that would affect you as the vendor who is potentially competing for these contracts.
We have a question. Does the Purchasing Bulletin also cover services needed by the state or just materials?
To answer your question, the Purchasing Bulletin does cover any commodity or service that a state agency would need, whether that was consulting services or steel or gravel or temporary staffing, for example. Auditing is also a big service that state agencies solicit. So yes, it does include both. So one of the final things that Senior Buyer Melissa Petrie will cover is vendor resolution methods, in the event there is a dispute between a private entity and a state of West Virginia agency. So let's start going through some of the objectives that we talked about. Why does the state of West Virginia, with its approximately 25,000 employees, hundreds of agencies spread throughout all 55 counties in West Virginia, need to buy anything from the private sector? Oftentimes, West Virginia state agencies we cannot manufacture or provide some of the things that state agencies need to fulfill their mission. Or in other cases, it would not be cost effective if we developed the processes to manufacture certain goods or provide certain services. In addition, one advantage to the state government procurement procedures that we're going to discuss is, with the state of West Virginia's buying power being so large, as we said, hundreds of agencies throughout all 55 counties, we have a way to harness the bulk buying power of all those agencies with all those needs and standardize certain commodities and services that we purchase. For example, I mentioned those statewide contracts that are exclusive agreements for commonly procured needs of state agencies. Those statewide contracts should be for something like paper or fuel that nearly every agency is going to need. So as opposed to every agency procuring those things individually, we will bulk buy, for lack of a better term, some of those things, which drives the price down considerably for the state of West Virginia. I guess it would be sort of like the difference between buying everything for your household from 7-Eleven or buying it from Sam's Club. Now, in some cases, which we will discuss, I do want to mention because it may be something that would fit your business entity. State agencies may find themselves in an emergency situation where life or property is at stake. And we frequently find that when there's been a natural disaster in the state of West Virginia and there's building damage, road damage, or in the event of an old mining complex falling in and causing a flood. If your business entity would be in the disaster response business, whether it's tree cutting, mine reclamation, or construction repair, I do want you to be aware that the state often will have to enter into an emergency agreement with a vendor without bidding it out. I think the biggest differentiation for how the state of West Virginia procures certain things from the private sector is going to be at a certain dollar threshold, whether something is going to be above or below the $25,000 threshold, the expected dollar amount. Now, if a state agency needs something that is under $25,000 or is expected to be under $25,000, the state agency has the authority to procure this strictly between the agency and the vendor community. Now, depending on where in that under $25,000 world the procurement is going to fall, state agencies may have to get written bids from the vendor community, but if you, the vendor community, would be providing something under that amount, then you would only have to deal with the state agency. Now, in contrast to that, if what you would potentially be selling to the state is expected to be over $25,000, then our agency, the West Virginia Purchasing Division, would be soliciting that material on behalf of that state agency. It's still the state agency buying it, but for anything over $25,000, that procurement would be going through the formal purchasing process with our agency. The most important thing for you to remember, whether you are buying something under or over $25,000, is that for the solicitation response that you submit to the state, whatever your written price is going to be, if it's under $25,000, your response would need to go to that state agency directly. If something is going through the formal purchasing process, it would need to go to the Purchasing Division in Building 15 at the West Virginia State Capitol Complex. And we'll talk a little bit more later about how you would know whether something is expected to be over or under $25,000 when I start showing you screens from the West Virginia Purchasing Bulletin. Now, one advantage you have or at least one procedural advantage you may have if your business transactions would be under $25,000 with the state of West Virginia. You can market yourself to those agencies' purchasing officers directly. And we have a list of them on our website. The link is the third bullet down in that left column on the current slide. And, whether or not you know which agencies would buy your particular goods and services, you may have an idea of 4 or 5 different agencies that, would most likely need what it is that you do. And we even have resources on our website that would help you market yourself to those state agencies that you may identify. We'll give you links to our vendor procurement guide at the end of this presentation, and the vendor registration office at the purchasing division can help you navigate that as well. So I mentioned that in the under $25,000 world, there may be different procedures for how you would compete for those particular solicitations. And I want to go into a little bit more detail about that because, as far as your business's specific transactions in that under $25,000 world, you may already be thinking, well, I'll never sell anything to the state over $25,000. So for that under $25,000 world, I want to tell you what would be required when you are submitting your price to the state. Now, when it comes to anything that is going to cost a state agency $2,500 or less, the state agency is actually not required to solicit competitive bids for those transactions. It would not be cost effective for an agency to have to solicit bids for something that is that small a dollar value, which may cover what transactions would be available for your agent, from your business entity right away. Now, if the state agency is buying something between $2,500 and $10,000, the agency would be required to solicit verbal bids from companies, but that is just as simple as the state agency would call you up and say, I need 35 widgets that you provide. What would your price be on that? And then later the agency would inform you whether or not you were the low bidder meeting the specifications of those widgets. So up to $10,000, not a lot of hassle on your part in order to provide competition to the state of West Virginia. I've not made you fill out any forms or anything thus far if this particular transaction is going to be under $10,000. Now, the last threshold in this under $25,000 world is if what the state agency needs is going to cost between $10,000 and $25,000. In this case, the state agency does have to get a price from you on paper. But, as you all look at these 3 different thresholds and think about what it is that you provide, the average cost of what you provide to your customers on a daily basis, you may already have a picture of how much time and energy you would have to put into competing for state business. And hopefully that you can look at these thresholds and realize that you can compete for state orders without giving up a lot of your valuable time thus far. Now, as we mentioned before, if something is expected to exceed $25,000, it is going through the formal process that would be administered by the purchasing division, but that may not apply to your business model at all. So that's sort of the first point. Now, the second and largest point that I want to spend time with and leave you with the most information about is how do you know in the first place what the state of West Virginia needs at any given time? And as I mentioned, public bidding opportunities are publicly advertised in a publication called the West Virginia Purchasing Bulletin. Purchasing Bulletin has been around for a long time in various forms, and right now the Purchasing Bulletin lives on a website called wvoasis.gov. You can view the bulletin on wvoasis.gov without having to create an account, but I do encourage you to make a user ID for your company so that, because there are other advantages to doing that I'll go into detail about later. Now, if you make a user ID for yourself on behalf of your company at wvoasis.gov, your entity is assigned what's called a WVOasis vendor number, and that would be the number that the state would use to identify your entity, as you proceed with not only submitting a solicitation response to a state agency, but that would be your vendor number if you are awarded a contract or an order once you successfully receive an award from the state. Now, as far as what is going to be in the purchasing bulletin, as we mentioned, both commodities, physical goods are going to be advertised here, as well as services that all of our state agencies need if they are expected to exceed $10,000. Now, you may see something advertised in the purchasing bulletin that is expected to be under $10,000 if that particular state agency has decided they want to harness the publicity of the purchasing bulletin, which they will do, especially if the item that they need is something really unique, and it may be hard to solicit responses from that just by calling vendors to get a verbal response. Now, I'm trying to make this your avenue through which you would compete for state business as bureaucracy-free as possible, because I know your time is valuable. So I do want to mention here that you do not have to register with any state agency just to submit a bid to the state, whether it's a verbal bid or a written bid or something that you respond to through the West Virginia Purchasing Bulletin. There are no forms to fill out. There are no bureaucratic leaps that you have to make just to give the state a price. And that's because the state wants to encourage as much competition as possible when we are trying to, harness our buying power with the vendor community. So it would be a disadvantage to us if we made you go through a bunch of loopholes just for you to say, I'll give you 35 widgets for $5,000. If you're familiar with the vendor self-service portal at wvoasis.gov, which is your gateway into a lot of state purchasing information, if you decide to make a user ID and password for yourself on behalf of your entity, this is what the vendor self-service portal looks like. And if you've used it before, you may notice that it changed recently. There was an upgrade to this portal in the fall of 2020. So I'll take you through some of the differences in appearance of the vendor self-service portal, or whether you are seeing it now for the first time. I'll take you through some of the highlights. Now, the new vendor self-service portal, the text got very small. Hopefully it is appearing on your screen legibly. If not, let us know. I'll try to use my laser pointer here to point out what I want you to see. Now, what we are looking at here is what the current West Virginia Purchasing Bulletin looks like. And every line, when you first go into the bulletin, every line has a different project advertised. You have a brief description of what it is the state needs. You have the agency and procurement officer that is soliciting that particular commodity or service. And then you have the time remaining for you, the vendor, to submit a response to that particular solicitation, and a respond button if you want to get to work preparing your bid immediately. You can also search by keyword. If you don't want to go through the state of West Virginia's currently advertised solicitations page by page, which you very likely may not want to since your time is valuable, you can search by keyword like gravel, telephones, roofing, construction, reclamation, things of that nature. And I'll go into more detail about strategies for using the keyword search here shortly. But I did want you to see that we don't want it to be secret what the state of West Virginia is trying to buy. It's out there and it's public, and I encourage you to look at this if you do have the least amount of interest in competing for state business. Now, when it comes to that keyword search, the system is tricky in regard to what the keyword search will display for you. So I want to let you know I want you to know how it's built so you know how to search it in the most efficient way. when you are searching through the keyword search box, it's best to use as few words as possible. The vendor self-services keyword search box is not as instinctive as something like Google, which will probably get you to what you're looking for no matter how vague your description is, at least in my experience. So if you have to search multiple words in the keyword search box, I encourage you to keep it simple. And the examples that I'm going to take you through are building maintenance and phone system. And there's another tip that I have for you. In fact, it's essential when you are searching with multiple words. If you search for one word, for example, the system is going to put a wildcard, what's called in programming a wildcard on each side of your search term. And the wildcard in the vendor self-service search is an asterisk. Now, if you are, the wildcard on one word, is going to give you a match if building appears anywhere within the description of that project. Now, if you are looking at something like building maintenance or phone system, I encourage you to put a wildcard between each word, phone and system. And hopefully you can see on this example where there's 3 wildcards, asterisk phone, asterisk system, asterisk. What this is going to do for you, let's say in the project's actual description, the state agency entered this advertisement as phone and fax system. So you don't eliminate that match from showing up for you if you just type phone system. I want you to put that wildcard between phone and system, and that's going to cause something like phone and fax system to appear for you, even though you didn't think to use the word fax. And hopefully that's clear. If it's not, please let me know. I know that's kind of a tricky, inconvenient thing that you have to do when you're searching by keyword, but as I mentioned, it's not as instinctive as Google, but I still want you to search the bulletin to find opportunities for your business. Now, I mentioned that creating a login ID in the vendor self-service portal does give your entity a lot of advantages if you want to invest the time in creating this profile for your business. You can search the bulletin as a guest by all means, but if you create this account for yourself, you can add information about your company that you can use, and when you respond to if you respond to multiple state solicitations, you don't have to fill out the same information on a paper bid over and over and over. It will save your information in your profile about your company, and it's ready anytime you are trying to submit a response. Having this profile for your business will also let you enter commodity codes, which I'll go into detail about, but it's going to lead to you getting those email-based commodity codes alert. Email-based commodity code alerts, I'm sorry. And also, if you create that user ID for yourself, that's going to give you the ability to bid online. That may or may not be a time saver for you. I want each business to respond in the way they're most comfortable with, whether that's on paper or online. You have the option to do both. Now, I will mention if you are the successful vendor for an order or a contract, there are state registrations you'll have to go through, which we'll tell you about. I do want to mention that creating that user ID in vendor self-service does not register you with any state agency. It is merely giving you that user ID to access this platform anytime you want to log in as on behalf of your company. You can create multiple user IDs for the same business. In fact, I encourage you to do that. Or at the very least, use an email address when you create your login that is checked by multiple employees. That way, if one employee is on vacation, for example, or if you have turnover at your company, you're not left without access to the state of West Virginia's vendor self-service portal. Somebody else can pick it up. Or if you get a bid alert about a particular project, it doesn't sit unchecked and you miss out on competing for that opportunity. Of the various state government registrations you would have to go through in order to receive a contract, The Purchasing Division's vendor registration program is the only one that you can complete online in this portal. And if you were to register your business with the Purchasing Division, which you wouldn't have to do until you are actually the successful vendor for an order, we would require two things from your business in order to complete that registration. A disclosure of information about your company, so the state of West Virginia knows to whom we are awarding a particular order or contract. And depending on the dollar amount of what you would be receiving from a state agency, there may be a $125 annual fee. Neither of these would be required if you are just at the stage where you want to read the bulletin and submit a response, submit some prices for a particular commodity or service that you can provide. The Finance Division's registration is not part of our registration, but I will mention if you are receiving money from a state agency, you would need to send a W-9 to the state in order for those funds to be dispersed. And that's something that you can email to the Finance Division using this email that we have on the last bullet point. Now, I do want to show you the dashboard of this vendor self-service portal that you have at your disposal, because it is genuinely helpful to you if you decide to compete for state business to have access to these online resources. One of the screens I'm showing is an account summary that shows some of the information that will be saved if you set up this record for your business. Now, also I want to show you some of the things you have the ability to keep up to date with the state. Under Edit My Account, you can keep your addresses up to date, whether that's your ordering address, payment address, different branches of your company. You also can maintain user IDs for your entity. You don't have to just have one user IDs. You can set up multiple logins for various employees and even give each employee different levels of access if you so choose. Now, the most important part of this that I will go into more detail about is the commodities that you can enter that lead you to those email-based commodity alerts. And this is one of the most valuable things that I can cover in the vendor self-service portal, and I'm going to go into more detail about that. But I did want you to see what you had at your disposal and some of the different things that you can keep updated with the state of West Virginia related to your business entity.
We have a couple of questions that have come in from the same vendor, two questions. Can the fee be waived, and where can you find the disclosure form?
Can the fee be waived? There are some exceptions to the $125 vendor registration fee. For example, if your company has not yet done $2,500 worth of business with all state agencies in the course of a year, you don't have to pay that annual fee if you never exceed that $2,500 aggregate threshold. Now, so that is an exception to the fee based on dollar amount. Now, other potential exceptions to whether or not you would have to pay that annual fee would be if you're providing a commodity or service that's deemed to be non-competitive. The $125 fee is not required, but those are very specific commodities like advertising, aviation fuel. There's a list of those in Section 9 of something we call the Purchasing Division Procedures Handbook. But, other than that, there are not a lot of exceptions to that fee unless it's based on dollar threshold or what you are providing in your specific transaction with a state agency. Now, your second question, where is the disclosure of information form? The disclosure of information is one half of the Purchasing Division's vendor registration program. You can provide the disclosure of information on paper or online. On paper, that would be through a form called the WV1 form, which is downloadable from the Purchasing Division's website, wvpurchasing.gov, or you can enter and electronically sign your disclosure of information in this vendor self-service portal on another tab. So whichever you're more comfortable with. Either way, we will accept that disclosure whether you sign for it on paper or electronically sign for it in the VSS portal. And if that doesn't answer both questions, please let me know. Now, one thing I want to give you a preview of is what is a particular solicitation going to look like in detail in the West Virginia Purchasing Bulletin. And you may recall back here, I showed you what the bulletin looks like when you're looking at the list of current projects out for bid. And honestly, this doesn't give you a lot of information. You can't prepare a response based on one line of information. So if something catches your eye and you think, well, I can do that, you can click on each particular advertisement, and that takes you to a page with more detail that looks like this. And this is where you would actually see the nitty-gritty of what the state is trying to buy, whether it's a commodity or a service. This is going to have a series of downloadable attachments, which is going to have something like part numbers, architectural diagrams, specifications for a service or a project. There may be part numbers that you can download and submit a price for one by one. Whatever it is the state is trying to buy, it's going to be described down to the very last detail through the downloadable information once you click on each advertisement in the bulletin. And you would want to read everything about a particular solicitation before you submitted a response, because not only is there going to be potential part numbers or specs, but there are also terms and conditions in regard to that transaction with the state that you would want to read and familiarize yourself with before you sign. So you're not just given one line of information to prepare your price from. Now, what I showed you on the previous screen was under the attachment tab on that particular solicitation. Under the general information tab on that advertised solicitation, you see a lot of the information that you would expect: who the procurement officer is within state government that is administering that solicitation, what agency is they're with, their contact information, what is the response deadline for that particular project, things of that nature. And hopefully that shows up legibly on your screen. If not, I hope that sometime before the end of today, you go to the purchasing bulletin and look at some of these that are live. And now I finally want to get to the commodity code alerts, and I want to start by explaining, if you're not familiar, what is a commodity code in the first place. Everything on earth that can be manufactured or sold is classified by what we in the procurement community call a commodity code. The comparison I make for this, and I know that my metaphor has a shelf life, and I won't be able to use it forever because people won't know what I'm talking about, but I compare the different commodity code library, I compare the different commodity code libraries to the Dewey Decimal System that you may remember from the school library that classified whether a book was fiction, fantasy, nonfiction, etc. Commodity codes, and the particular commodity code library that the state of West Virginia uses is the United Nations Commodity Code Library. But this is literally hundreds of thousands of numbers that classify everything that can possibly be made or sold on the earth, whether it's steel, gravel, IT consulting, military hardware, you name it. There is a commodity code for absolutely everything that is made, including whatever it is that your business does. You can look through the United Nations Commodity Code Library on a website called unspsc.org. And I encourage you to do this because I want you to find the United Nations commodity codes that identify what it is you're in business to do. And then I would want you to take these codes and go back to the vendor self-service portal and enter those particular codes in your company's profile that you make with the state of West Virginia. And you see this blue button right here that says Add Commodity Codes. And this is something that will be saved in your company's record within the vendor self-service portal that identifies to the state what it is you are in the business of doing. Now, the advantage of doing that is when the state of West Virginia puts out a project for advertisement in the bulletin, on our end, we have to identify what we're buying by entering commodity codes on our end. Now, if you have set up a record for your company in the vendor self-service portal and entered United Nations commodity codes in your vendor profile, there should be a match when the state puts something out for bid and identified it with a commodity code, and you have the same commodity code saved in your record. You should get an email alert saying, hey, the state of West Virginia has put such and such out for bid. We see in your profile you may be able to provide that. Maybe you should go to the purchasing bulletin and check it out. And this is something that's going to save you from reviewing the purchasing bulletin on a regular basis, because you may not have time to read this list of projects as frequently as we would like you to. You're not in the business of doing that. You're in the business of doing whatever it is you provide for your customers. Now, I don't want the commodity code email alerts to replace some time you would invest in reading this bulletin. But think of this keyword search in the bulletin and reading this list as a left hand of power that you have, and I want you to think of the commodity code alerts as the right hand of power, because I want you to take a two-fisted approach in learning what it is the state of West Virginia and all of our agencies in the 55 counties are trying to buy at any given time. So anytime there may be an opportunity for your business to provide that commodity or service for the state, you're aware of it. Now, you may decide that you don't have the time to prepare a response on a given week for something that we have advertised as a need, but you can't make the decision on whether or not you're going to respond if you don't know that the state is trying to buy it. So this two-handed approach is something that I want you to keep in mind, just so you know what it is the state needs and if you can provide it. And that is the first and most important strategy to competing for state business that I can give you. Now, the second strategy, which I promise is not as long an explanation as the first strategy, is to market yourself directly to our state agency procurement officers. Now, I mentioned that this method is especially valuable if you already have in mind that what you may potentially provide to the state is going to be in that under $25,000 world. You remember that over and under $25,000 threshold that we talked about. Now, we list, whether they like it or not, we list all state agency procurement officers on our website at this link that I have provided on this slide. And remember, I said that you may look at certain state agencies and think, well, I know they would need this, I know they would need that, and we can provide it. So you can develop a marketing strategy where you send information regularly and or just introduce yourself and your company to the particular purchasing officers that would be the ones that need your stuff. Now, one thing that I've recommended to some companies, and that many of them have done, is just prepare a one-page notice about who you are, what you do, and where you are, and send it to the procurement officers that you think might need your particular services. And that gives them something that's brief enough that they'll take the time to read it, but it's enough for them to act on when they are picking up the phone to get 3 verbal bids, or sending out an RFQ form to get 3 written bids, or, God forbid, in the event of an emergency where life or property is at stake, and they're trying to find somebody who can cut some trees down in 3 hours, or fix a landslide that's blocking a state road, or help fix a building whose roof has fallen in from snow. They already know who you are and where you are, and they may think of you in those times where they are trying to reach out to somebody quickly who can do the work. Marketing yourself to these procurement officers beforehand and building that relationship could very well pay off for your business in any of those circumstances. And remember, we list all the contact people for the various agencies on our website. Now, some information that I want you to know if you are deciding that you may actually want to do your homework on this state procurement thing is a lot of the information that we make available on the transparency section of our website, wvpurchasing.gov. Now, the way we have sort of outlined the procurement cycle is what does the state need, what vendors have made offers, and who is the eventual successful vendor. We have this 3-part cycle of information public on our website, the transparency website, in 3 different sections. Of course, we've already covered the section that answers the question, what is the state seeking? And that's the West Virginia Purchasing Bulletin. Now, what I have not mentioned is on the Purchasing Division website, after a bid opening for a centralized solicitation, we make each vendor's response public. So you can go back many years and see for a particular thing the state was buying, who made an offer, what was their price, and what were the details of their offer. Now, what is the advantage to you of seeing seeing a vendor's bid from a year ago or 2 years ago? Well, if you're new to the state procurement process, you have a particular commodity or service that you sell. You may want to know who the competition is, or how much competition there is, and what their prices are, so you can beat them. All this information is public after bids are open for this particular solicitation. And then, of course, for a lot of people, the most important question, who is the successful vendor? This is covered in our Notice of Award report. So for what the state of West Virginia has purchased, the who, what, and where of all this is public on the transparency section, which may be helpful to you as you plot your response and price to a current solicitation. Now, the third strategy, and it is the last one, I promise. The third strategy of competing for state business, and by the way, these are not the only strategies to compete for state orders and contracts. These are just 3 common ones that I want to outline for you in hopes that 1 or 2 or 3 may be relevant to your business model. The third strategy I want to talk about is something that I mentioned earlier, and that's statewide contracts. And a statewide contract is usually an exclusive agreement with one vendor for a period of time for the most frequently purchased commodities and services that all state of West Virginia agencies need. Things like fuel, paper, temporary staffing, and I'll show you a list, computers, oil, light bulbs, you name it. This is where the state is harnessing our bulk buying power and going to Sam's Club instead of going to 7-Eleven for what we need. Now, if you can provide something on one of these statewide contracts, we can't add you to that statewide today. But when these statewide agreements expire, they go back out for bid in the purchasing bulletin like anything else. So there may be 6 months left on a statewide contract with a vendor that's already competed and been awarded that contract. But that gives you 6 months to research and plan for when that contract goes out for bid, how you're going to respond. And again, that's where that transparency section of wvpurchasing.gov could really come in handy, because you can look at how that statewide contract was awarded 6 months ago, who was the competition and what did their pricing look like. And whenever the statewide contract goes back out for bid, you can be ready to compete and potentially be the successful vendor that takes over that exclusive contract for that commodity. And for all the agencies in the 55 counties, if there is a statewide contract in place for a certain catalog item, all of the commodities that we just mentioned and the ones that I'll show you, state agencies are required to utilize the statewide contract if there is one in place for the computer they need, the paper they need, the fuel they need. You can look at all the current active statewide contracts on this website that's at the bottom of this slide. And that page looks like this. And you see auto parts, truck parts, light bulbs, office furniture, heavy trucks, industrial supplies, fuel, food, fingerprinting services. I think last time I counted, there were 80 statewide contracts for different commodities or services. Now, as I said, we can't add you to a statewide today. It has to go back out for bid. So that makes the third strategy a longer-term pursuit than if 35 widgets are out for bid in the purchasing bulletin this week. However, even though it's a longer-term pursuit, being the successful vendor for a statewide contract is a potentially higher yield award for your business. Because as I said, you're potentially the exclusive provider to the state of West Virginia for paper, fuel, whatever. And any state agency that needs it has to come to you for it. So longer term pursuit, but potentially higher yield. Now, I would miss something greatly if I did not mention our vendor registration program at the purchasing division. Again, you don't have to go through this registration to submit an offer to the state, but it would be required before you would receive that contract or order. And as I mentioned, the vendor registration requirements are that aforementioned disclosure of information, and in some cases, depending on dollar threshold and what the commodity is, there may be an annual fee required of $125. Both those pieces would need to be in place for you to be registered with the purchasing division, but you do not have to go through this process unless you are the apparent successful vendor for something that you have competed for. Now, I've mentioned this disclosure of information without elaborating on it. The things that we would need to know about your business, your legal name, your physical address, your telephone number, mostly pretty basic stuff that you shouldn't be shocked the state would need to know if we're awarding a contract to you. Now, some other things we would need to know about your company as part of this disclosure are the owners and officers that are associated with your business entity, the city of their residence, and the name of the bank where your company stores its assets. We don't need to know any account numbers. That's not for EFT. It's just basically who you are, who owns your company, and what financial institution you use. That's it. Now, for all the different strategies that we've discussed and all the things that you would potentially have to navigate, not only to compete for state business, but to register and receive that award so you can start providing a particular commodity or service to the state, if you're the successful vendor, the Purchasing Division's Vendor Registration Office can be your central point of contact to navigate you through this whole process. We are reachable at the Purchasing Division. In normal times, you would be able to make an appointment with us in Building 15 at the Capitol Complex, but right now we can still communicate with you through email, U.S. mail, or by telephone. But we want our vendor registration unit to be your central point of contact that illustrates the entire state government procurement process for you to give you the information you would need to compete successfully with for state agency business in the 55 counties. Now, one thing I want to mention is the SWAN program that the Purchasing Division administers. The SWAN program is something that was created by the legislature in 2012, and tasked the purchasing division with certifying whether a business fell into various categories, whether you're a small business, a woman-owned business, a veteran-owned business, or a minority-owned business. If your company may fall within these categories, you can apply for small women and minority-owned business certification status, send it to purchasing division for review, and potentially receive this 2-year certification. And it is free, by the way, to apply. Now, what good does it do you if you are a SWAN certified business with the state of West Virginia? Well, if you're competing in West Virginia, for a few commodities that the state procures, the SWAN certification status may give you a vendor preference. But let's say that after listening to me for an hour and looking at all the things regarding state of West Virginia procurement, you don't want to have anything to do with it. And that's okay, but there may still be something in SWAN certification that can help your business. And that is if your entity wants to compete for government business in another state or with a federal agency. West Virginia's SWAN certification status may help you outside of West Virginia or with the federal government or with some other entity, because if another state or federal entity will reciprocate West Virginia's SWAN certification preference, you may be able to compete with out-of-state vendors as if you are a resident vendor in that state. We've seen vendors apply for SWAN certification status not because they are competing with West Virginia government contracts, but because they're bidding on something out of state. And we would be delighted if we saw a West Virginia company get West Virginia SWAN certified and successfully compete for a contract out of state and bring that business home. In addition, we've had companies apply for West Virginia SWAN certification. We had just as one example, we had an excavation company that needed to get SWAN certified because they were bidding on an excavation contract with the water company. So there's various entities that may recognize you as West Virginia SWAN certified and give you a bidding preference when you are competing with them. We certainly want you to compete for West Virginia contracts, but this may help West Virginia vendors all over the country. And we're happy to provide whatever documentation we would need for you to show these other entities that you are West Virginia SWAN certified. Now, at this point, I'm going to turn this over to Senior Buyer Melissa Petrie.
Good morning. I apologize ahead of time for the scratchy voice. It's that time of year. If you have a problem understanding something I've said, just let us know and I can repeat it. From here, we're going to touch on some of the purchasing processes and the difference in an agency solicitation and the central purchasing. So there are a few types of solicitations that are advertised in the purchasing bulletin, as Mark had talked about earlier, and they're always accessible in the vendor self-service portion. So if you have a request for a quotation, if it's C, that's a central. That means it's over $25,000 and has come through central purchasing. If it's an ARSQ, that's with the agency and it has fallen under the $25,000. So they'll be taking care of that. But the request for quotation is awarded to the lowest bid meeting all mandatory requirements. So when either a buyer here at purchasing or one of the agencies look at those, it's based on cost and the mandatory requirements. If a vendor should miss one of those mandatories, they're automatically disqualified, and the buyer would then move on to the next submitted bid. So the agency request for quotations, like I said, those are solicited by the agencies themselves. Sometimes they'll use OASIS, and you'll see it will be in the VSS, as Mark stated earlier. They can choose to do that with the $10,000 and up. In the instructions to bidders, there are instructions there, and it will tell you if that particular solicitation can be submitted electronically, or you can send those in by mail, you can fax them in, they can be hand-delivered, you can have a courier bring those. We're going to move on with the types of solicitations that we advertise in the purchasing bulletin. So a CRFQ is a central request for quotation. That will be solicited through the purchasing division. That means it comes to a senior buyer here. And with those, you will submit your responses to us electronically through vendor self-service, and there's one that cannot come through that way, and we'll talk about that one in a little bit. You can fax it. If you're going to fax in your bid and your bid documents, please use this number that you see on your screen. Generally, there's a different fax number, but that number is not for you to submit your bid with, so make sure you always use this number. You can drop those in the mail. You can do U.S. mail, or you can use a courier. You're welcome to drop those off in person, but we absolutely do not accept emailed bids. You can't send those by email to the buyer. The buyer will, we can't open it and look at it, and we have no way to submit that. So we don't allow email bids. And when you're faxing your submitted documents, the very last page of your bid packet must have come through on the fax prior to that 1:30 deadline. If it's 1:31 or 1:32, that is considered a late bid. To obtain copies of the solicitation documents, you want to download those from wvoasis.gov. And I have vendors who will tell me, they'll call and say, hey, I only got 4 pages and there are no specifications included in that. So I'm going to just give you a little walkthrough of getting to those documents to download them. So once you're in VSS and you have found the solicitation that you want to view the requirements and the specifications, you'll click on that one. If you have to search for it, use the
Keyword search.
Keyword search, sorry, I'm struggling. Use the keyword search, find the solicitation that you're looking for, and then when you find that one, click on that solicitation number. You'll be able to tell where you could do that. And the next page will come, when the next page comes up, you will see a tab for attachments, and you want to open the links on that, underneath that tab. You will see to the right the different documents. It will say standard or final. You always want to choose the standard, because that's a complete document of whether it's the solicitation that's just gone out to bid or it's an addendum. If you choose the one that says final, you aren't getting anything but just the OASIS information that we include at the beginning of each solicitation. And all of those can be downloaded. If you have a problem with an electronically attached pricing page, call the buyer, reach out to the buyer that's listed on the front of that solicitation, and they can help you with that. They'll look into the issue, and it may take an addendum to fix that. But if you have any issues, let your buyer know, or get in touch with the WVOASIS help desk. So included in these attachments, you're going to find your instructions to vendors submitting bids. It will tell you whether or not there's a pre-bid, the vendor question deadline. So you can submit all of your questions to the buyer listed on the front up until that date and time, and then they will be forwarded to the agency for their responses. You will find your specifications, any additions, whether it be drawings or additional information for the product that they're looking for. A lot of times, if it's technical, then there will be information on, this is what we're looking for, this is what it looks like. So make sure you have all of the documents available in there. There can be pricing pages, construction documents, drawings, maps. Make sure you have all of those. Double check yourself before you send in your bid packet. You want to read the instructions to the vendors submitting bids because there is a lot of information there. Like I said, it will tell you about any previous meetings, your technical question deadline, and how to submit it, how to respond, and most importantly, it will give you your bid opening date and time. And as I said before, whether you are faxing your bid, if you're hand delivering it, if it came by courier, or you have submitted it through OASIS, everything has to be here prior to that 1:30 deadline. Like I said, if you have technical questions, you must submit those to the buyer's email address who's listed in the instructions to vendor in that instructions section. The buyer's name, phone number, and email will be there. And per West Virginia Code of State Rules, West Virginia, Code of State Rules 148 CSR 16.6B is the blackout period, and that's the communication between agency and vendors regarding this particular solicitation. As soon as the agency submits that to us here at purchasing, they are then under that blackout period, and they remain there until an award has been encumbered and finalized. So they cannot talk to you about it. If you have a contract with that same agency, you can talk to them about the current contract, but not the solicitation that's out there at that moment. So it can really cause some backup on the time period if the agency is talking to you. So some of the types of solicitations that we put into the bulletin and are accessible through the VSS. Best value purchasing is going to be, well, we're going to talk about that, and it's a request for proposal. And there's a lot of confusion about that. A request for quotation and a request for proposal are two completely different things. So the request for proposal is awarded on the highest scoring vendor. There's a two-part evaluation. You have your technical, which will be the first thing that we open on that bid opening day, and we read the company's name, the vendor's name, and at that point, that's it. And then you have your second part, which is cost, which should be in a separately sealed and marked envelope, that this is the cost for CRSP, whatever the number may be. Once the agency and purchasing have approved the vendor that they want to, today. Okay. Yeah, the apparent successful vendor, then we being purchasing, will set up a time to open the cost. And we will let the vendors and the agency know by fax when we're going to be doing that, when that's going to be scheduled. And the RSP, the CRSP, those cannot be submitted through the WVOASIS VSS portal. The size can sometimes be an issue, the size of files that you want to attach, and there's no way to hide the cost when we do it that way. So that will be prohibited, and you will see that when you're looking at it in VSS. That will be grayed out. You actually can't. It's not going to let you do that. So the next one is an expression of interest, or an EOI. These are for architectural and engineering services. The evaluation is based on the qualification and the experience of, of the vendor and their company. So those are ranked by the best value committee at the agency level. And there's an agency committee who will review your submission, and this will consist of 3 to 5 members. The agency has the choice whether or not to do oral interviews with the vendors. If they're going to do those, that is some more information that will be found within the bid documents. And it's at their discretion as to whether or not they do that. So once they have those scores and a recommendation, they will send it to the purchasing division for approval. The highest ranked vendor enters into negotiations, and if successful, there will be an award document from that. Some other types of solicitations that are advertised in the West Virginia Purchasing Bulletin and also accessible through VSS is an AEOI, which is an agency expression of interest. It will be advertised by the agency, and your responses will be submitted to the agency listed on the solicitation documents. Those won't come through purchasing. If it's a CEOI, that's a central expression of interest, we do that advertisement, and the responses are will be sent to us using one of the following. Of course, you can use the U.S. mail, and here's the address that you would send that to. You can fax those. Please use this fax number. They can be dropped off in person. It can be sent by courier. And now, this is fairly new. We haven't been doing it very long, but now you can submit those electronically through wvoasis.gov. And once again, email responses are never accepted. Anyone have any questions? Another type of solicitation is a request for information, or a CRSI. These are used for informational purposes only. If an agency is in need of something, and it's usually something either very technical or very large, and they're just not sure, you know, they've done market research and they're still not getting the information that they need. So we will post a request for information and let the vendors tell us, this is what you need, this is how you will get there. With an RFI, request for information, there is no award. It never turns into an award situation. It'll be advertised by us, and the responses are to be submitted to the West Virginia Purchasing Division by the date that's listed on the solicitation documents. And it's the same, it has to be here by 1:30 on the date that the bid is scheduled to open. Now, we say open because we're literally opening the bids, but in VSS, it will say bid closing date. It's one and the same. That's the last day that you can submit your bid package, your bid documents to, on your bid submission. It says here, you know, carefully review your bid before submitting to ensure all requirements are met and all of your documents have been completed. Can't stress that enough. Just, you know, make sure that, double check it, make sure that everything that needs to be signed, or your pricing page that needs to be filled out, your purchasing affidavit needs to be notarized, signed and sealed, and the date that you sign it must match the date of the notary stamp. That's one of the most common things that we get are purchasing affidavits with 2 different dates, and so we'll have to go back to you to get that redone. Review Section 8 of the General Terms and Conditions. That's where you'll find your insurance requirements. And a certificate of commercial general liability insurance is now required on all commodities and services that we advertise for. And we must have those before we can proceed with an award. And there may be other insurance requirements. The auto liability is usually one. And sometimes the crime and third-party fidelity. There are several different ones. Just double check those, make sure that you have all of your insurance requirements met. and you can submit that certificate of insurance with your bid packet. And one thing to add to the insurance for the certificate of commercial general liability, the state must be listed as an additional insured as well as a certificate holder. And the additional insured generally only affects the commercial general liability. That's the only one that they'll have to have that for. If the solicitation requires a bid bond, the bond must be submitted with your bid. We cannot accept that after the fact. Make sure that, again, that the date that it is notarized matches the date that you sign it. All your dates must be signed. Everything must have signatures. Make sure that your surety has placed their seal on the document. Again, that's make sure that it is with your bid. The vendor preference forms must be submitted with your bid. If you'll read sections 15 to 16 of the instructions to vendors, you'll see the information there and how that preference may apply and how to obtain the form. And these are just different things that may need to be submitted with your document package. Your purchasing affidavit, again, make sure that your dates match, your signature and dates match. An addendum acknowledgement form if there were any addendums. Double check that one. If there were 3, if you received 3 addendums, mark 3. And that way, when we're looking at your submitted packet, we know that you received all of the addendums and that you have all of the information that's needed to make a concise bid. Disclosure of interested parties to contracts. Here it tells you can contact the West Virginia Ethics Commission, and here's a phone number and an email. We generally don't send those out with the RFQs or RFPs. That usually comes after the fact. Licenses, certifications, or permits, if noted in Section 7 of the General Terms and Conditions. On construction, if you're a construction bidder, when you submit your a copy of your current certificate, your contractor certificate, make sure that it's signed by you. We get a lot of those that the vendor hasn't signed. If your licenses or certifications or permits require that notary stamp and your signature, make sure those have all been done. Complete the drug-free workplace affidavit and send it back in. And if it's applicable, submit your subcontractor list with your bid documents. We can ask you for that, and you have 1 day to get it to us. But if you already know who they're going to be, just go ahead and submit that at the same time. Okay, if you're submitting your response through WB Oasis, upload all required documents, add attachments. So you can see where the little pointer is there. It says add attachments. So that you'll go there to start the upload process for your documents. Again, your bid submission must be received by the scheduled date and time of the bid opening as it's listed on the instructions to vendors. You really need to monitor the VSS portal, especially for your solicitations, to make sure that you have any addendums that have come out. It could change the Q&A deadline. It can change your bid opening date. It can change specifications, add additional documents. You want to be sure that you keep up with those. Again, late bids will not be considered for award, and here is the West Virginia Code and Code of State Rules that covers that if you'd like to look that up. And there are no exceptions. Whether it's, we had a couple years ago with FedEx that had all the crashes, and it was in the South, and it really backed things up. And we had vendors whose bids did not get here in time. So just make sure you give yourself plenty of time. I absolutely recommend that you do not wait until 1:20 to submit your bid, because anything can happen. and we have pretty much seen anything happen. It varies between the agencies and tier purchasing, centralized solicitations. The agency can develop procedures based on their agency delegated purchasing authority. They will review the solicitation documents, or you need to review the solicitation documents on how to submit to the agency. And the blackout period doesn't apply there because the agency is who's actually, who has published the solicitation, and that's where your information will go to. Centralized solicitations, again, your responses can be submitted electronically through VSS unless it's an RFP. There could be other cases, but usually that's the one. Fax those to 304-558-3970. That's the only fax number that you should be using to fax in your bids. Paper bids can be sent by mail or dropped off in person or sent by courier. Again, the fax bids are not considered complete until that last page has made it through, and it must be received and time-stamped by 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Anything after that 1:30 cutoff will be considered late and disqualified. We now have, since the pandemic, we do not have public bid openings as we did before, where people can actually come in. Now we do those virtually, and here's a link that you can follow, and you go there and you pick the date, and it will give you instructions, the link, and you can watch us do the bid openings virtually. Following the bid opening, all of our bids are posted on the Purchasing Division's website, and you see that here. And it will be every bid that was submitted and opened in its entirety. And those are usually available by 10 o'clock the next day. The bid evaluation, the first and foremost thing in a bid evaluation is to ensure that all the mandatory specifications have been met. The solicitation is advertised by the Purchasing Division. We have solicited on behalf of the, whatever agency, and the agency will complete their evaluation and submit their recommendation award to the Purchasing Division buyer. There will be times if something's not quite clear in your bid submission, the agency will ask us to do a bid clarification, and you will receive a letter outlining what it is that the agency wanted to know or wanted to clarify. The Purchasing Division buyer will review the recommendation to award. We will review your submitted bid documents, and then we may ask you for more documents, whether it be your insurance, or if it's construction, then at that time we are going to ask you for whatever other bonds may be needed. Could be the insurance again, or your bonds. And after we have reviewed and we have all of your documents in order, then the contract will be awarded to the lowest responsible bidder. Now, as Mark was saying earlier, you can register in the VSS and not pay the fee at that time, but that will have to be done prior to award. You have to be in good standing with, and it may not stop at this depending on what the commodity or service is. You will have to be registered in good standing with the West Virginia Secretary of State's office, with the West Virginia Tax Department, and the West Virginia Insurance Commission. So all of those things you want to make sure that are up to date. And a lot of times with vendors who are registered, it may cut close to the date that this award is going to be, that your registration will expire, so you want to update that. For the award process, if they've been advertised by a tier purchasing, which will be a CRS2, a CRSP, or a COI, all bidders will be notified when the contract has been awarded. And it will be by email if you have provided an email address. And that's another thing on the solicitation documents. In the specifications, well, the last page of terms and conditions and in the solicitation as well, in the specifications, we ask you for contact information. Please give as much of that as you can. We need a name, we need the address of your company, a phone number, fax number, email address. And I know a lot of people don't use faxes as much now, so make sure that you have given a good email address. And just remember that you can't begin any work or deliver any goods to the agency until you have received the encumbered contract and coordinated with the agency. They may want to have a meeting prior to, depending on what they were, what they had out to bid. A lot of technical and construction will have meetings in the very beginning to set up a timeline on how they want to do things. Once you receive that encumbered contract, the blackout period is no longer in effect, and you can reach out to the agency. And your agency contact should be listed on the front of that award document. And if not, you can reach out to your buyer at purchasing that's listed there, and they can give you the information you need to reach out to the agency. There are, if things don't go exactly as we thought they would, there are two types of protests. We have your specification protest, and that must be submitted in writing to the purchasing director at least 5 days prior to the bid opening. If you send it in here the day before, it's too late, and the solicitation is going to move on to the bid opening. You can protest an award, and that must be submitted in writing to the purchasing director within 5 days after the purchase order. And it is up to the vendor to know what those dates are. So the date on the email or the fax letter that says, we appreciate you doing business with the state, that's the date. You have 5 days from that date on the award protest. And those procedures can be found on our website as well. Another process that we do here are change orders to contracts. We have renewals and other modifications to existing contracts may only be executed if renewal language exists in that original contract. If it is a 1-year contract, there are no extensions in that contract. It's finished at the end of that time period. When are they necessary? Anytime that it changes the face of the contract, the price that was in the original contract, or goods and services that need to be changed. And again, it's the same as with the award. You cannot do any of that work until you receive your approved written change order. I need to move faster. If it's purchasing division, it will be a C. If it is agency, it will be an A. And I'm going to try to speed this up a little bit. Or do you want to take over?
Yeah, you just summarize.
Okay. So the change order procedures, it's not something that can just happen in one day. The agency sends that over to us. We review it, approve it. We make up that change order, add the correct documents. It goes through our signature process here, and then it has to go to the AG's office for approval as to form. Then it will come back for encumbrance, and then the work can begin, or the change that was involved in that. Just a few things to remember. We cannot accept late bids. For formal acquisitions, you cannot communicate with the agencies regarding that specific solicitation. All questions must be submitted to the purchasing buyer prior to that deadline for questions. And we encourage you to submit all the required documentation with your bid to speed up the award process. Review the purchasing and agency master terms and conditions to make sure that you understand what those requirements are. And as you see here, there are the links to each one of those. If there are going to be delays, it's important that you add that, or you let the agency know that. so they know what to expect. And, you know, they have to, your performance is what makes or breaks the contract. So they will document any communications if there are problems and try to resolve those. If it isn't resolved that way, then they will have to contact us here at Purchasing for further guidance. And here are just a few references for your review. And I'm going to hand this over to Mark. I apologize for the stuttering and stammering. If you have any questions, let us know.
All right, just to sort of wrap up, we mentioned a few of these resources that we would take you back to and point you to where you could find them. The Vendor Procurement Guide is sort of a how-to for businesses that are brand new to marketing yourselves to State of West Virginia agency procurement officers. Remember, that was strategy 2 on the outline that I went through. There's also links on our website, not only about state procurement, but also about the procurement system itself, WV Oasis. Remember that if you want to get into the nitty-gritty of what the state has bought in the past, that transparency section has a tremendous amount of information on it for you. And if you run into technical problems with the vendor self-service portal, like your password is locked or something like that, the Oasis help desk is available for any kind of technical problem you may have with the vendor self-service portal. And this is what the Vendor Procurement Guide looks like that we have written for businesses that are new to competing for state contracts. Now, something that I'll add to my section about West Virginia Small Women and Minority-Owned Business Certification, occasionally we collaborate with the U.S. Small Business Administration, especially if there's something in the procurement community that has changed, or if there's a specific opportunity that we can bring to West Virginia vendors in regard to SWAN certification or any other federal opportunity. Sometimes I learn about these from the vendor community. Sometimes we learn about this from the SBA, but we're happy to collaborate in any way possible to help West Virginia businesses. So the 3 things that I want to leave you with, the 3 strategies, by no means are they the only way that you might successfully receive a state order or a state contract, but the first and most important is read the West Virginia Purchasing Bulletin so you can learn what it is the state's trying to buy. The rest of this information is useless unless you actually know what we need at any given point. You can read the bulletin, search it, sign up for those email alerts based on commodity, but it's a lot of muscle when it comes to expanding your business into government contracts. You know, second strategy we've covered, market yourself to state agency procurement officials that are at agencies that you may think need what you have. That's especially relevant in that under $25,000 world where you can procure and compete directly with the state agency without going through the formal purchasing process with our agency. Third strategy, longer term but higher yield. Familiarize yourself with what statewide contracts we have in place at any given time for those frequently purchased commodities or services statewide. See which ones that you may be able to provide in the future. Look and see when they expire, because when they go back out for bid, after doing your homework, you may have a really good shot at taking over those exclusive arrangements with all state agencies in the 55 counties. There's a lot of tools at your disposal, and of course it all depends on how much time you're willing and able to dedicate to this. You know, we know that you are not in business to learn about state government purchasing, but the purpose of this and all the information we provide online is to make it as easy as possible for you to get into the arena and have a seat at the table for anything that the state needs, whether it's knowing how to become an expert with reading the purchasing bulletin, but also the different advantages your company has with utilizing that vendor self-service portal at wvoasis.gov, learning how to contact the procurement officer statewide that actually need what you can provide, and also making sure that information on past state purchases is as transparent as possible. And of course, our two agency programs, vendor registration and SWAN certification, there's advantages to keeping both up to date with the purchasing division. The contact information for senior buyer Melissa Petrie and myself is on this slide, and also our vendor registration coordinator that works in my unit, Tara Oliver, she's also available to answer vendor registration questions and be your central point of contact for procurement needs. You know, as I said, we want the purchasing division's vendor registration unit to be your central point of contact for lighting the way through the complexity of state procurement. And I know that buyers like Melissa Petrie can also answer questions in the nitty-gritty regarding different contract types and how that affects the way in which you bid for specific opportunities. So we are all at your disposal and want to assist you through this process. So we bring more vendors into the table, increase competition. It helps the state of West Virginia procure items at a lower price, and it also helps you expand your business once you get into this arena.
Okay, we're running behind, so thanks to everybody for sticking around with us. Feel free, any questions, there are a few in the chat and Q&A window that we'll follow up with email after the webinar, and feel free to reach out to us following. We will send you a survey this afternoon, and we appreciate you taking a few minutes to fill that out. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you all for being here today and taking the time.